The drum set was originally created by musicians in military brass bands. These players wanted to be able to create a percussive march feel without requiring multiple percussionists, so the drum set was the answer. The bass drum played on 1/8 reed, and the snare drum played press rolls on 2/4. This is an effective way to play brass band march music in an indoor setting. One style that bridged the gap between this military march and later styles is called second line, named after parades in New Orleans, which used marching drums, but these drummers syncopated the groove instead of playing it straight. You'll notice that the role of the bass drum and the snare drum is changed to become more syncopated and dance-like, while the cymbals take over the role of playing 2/4. The concept of playing syncopated rhythms alongside a steady hi-hat becomes very important in later styles of jazz. In the 1930s, swing music was the most popular form of music, and swing drumming was key to this style. The hi-hat or the snare drum would be used to play swung eighth notes, and the bass drum would play heavy quarter notes, give the band and dancers a steady pulse to follow along to while soloists played. In the 1940s, drummers like Kenny Clarke and Max Roach moved this swing pattern to the ride cymbal, which freed up the hi-hat to keep beats in 2/4 and made the snare drum and the bass drum more active voices on the drum set. The cymbals could keep steady time while the snare drum and the bass drum interacted with the soloists, pushing the music and fellow bandmates to new musical heights. This came to a head in the bebop era of jazz, where complicated melodies and rhythms from soloists pushed syncopation on the drum set to become even heavier. The snare drum and bass drum now used more complicated broken triplet rhythms, and the ride cymbal strayed from the simple swing pattern, becoming a whole new voice to experiment and interact with on the drum set. In the 50s, bebop drummers were exposed to African and Cuban drumming styles when the so-called Latin craze hit American popular music. Passages like this triplet-based Afro-Cuban beat utilized what are called polyrhythms on the drum set, with each different voice imitating a different African instrument from a traditional African drum circle. Bebop drummers would take this knowledge and apply it to jazz, using overarching polyrhythms to inspire soloists and create tension. Jazz hit the 60s and 70s, rock and funk bands were becoming more popular. What drummers in these bands were doing was moving the swing beat to the hi-hat and emphasize the downbeat on the bass drum. In addition to this, they'd start to place a snare hit on 2/4 called a backbeat. And this made the music much more danceable and relatable to the untrained ear. Eventually, drummers would straighten out this beat, and they'd experiment with syncopation with the snare and the bass drum, creating the modern funk beats heard in the 60s and 70s from musicians like James Brown and Sly Stone. Elements of all these different styles can be heard in dance and electronic music of today. Much of the popular music of today is characterized by the same heavy quarter notes from the bass drum, backbeats on 2 and 4, and hints of syncopation from the snare drum, and a steady beat on the hi-hat. The evolution of the drum set and how it was played were key elements in many of the musical innovations that we have seen in popular music in the last century.